My name's Richard. I'm 68 years old. 3 years ago, I buried my wife. 2 years ago, I was 100% sure I was moving to the Philippines. I had the visa research, the neighborhood peaked, the whole thing. And then I took 1 week in Thailand as a favor to a guy I barely knew, just to compare, just to be thorough. And by day 5, I was sitting in a hospital in Chiang Mai holding a bill for 1,400 baht, about $40, thinking, oh no, I've got the wrong country. Let me tell you how that happened. I grew up in a town outside Toledo, Ohio. My dad worked at the G plant for 31 years. My mom taught fourth grade. I was the middle of three boys. Nothing about my childhood was interesting, and I mean that as a compliment. We had dinner at 6. We went to church on Sunday. My dad drank 2 beers on Friday nights and fell asleep in his recliner watching Johnny Carson. That was the whole shape of it. I went to community college for 2 years, dropped out, took a job at a warehouse that shipped auto parts, and I stayed in that industry for 34 years. Started on the loading dock. Ended up as a logistics coordinator, making $62,000 a year. I know that doesn't sound like much. It wasn't, but it was steady, and steady was the whole point. I met Margaret in 1979 at a bowling alley in Parisburg. She was there with her sister. I was there with 2 guys from work. She was wearing a yellow sweater, and she laughed at something I said that wasn't even that funny. We got married 11 months later. We had one daughter, Rebecca. We bought a small ranch house on a quiet street. We stayed in that house for 41 years. Margaret was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in the spring of 2020. That's not a story I'm going to track you through. If you've been near it, you already know. If you haven't, I hope you never do. 7 months from diagnosis to the funeral, she was 64 years old. I sat by her bed at Mercy Health in Toledo, and I held her hand, and I watched the woman who had made every Christmas of my adult life stop breathing on a Tuesday afternoon in October. I went home to an empty house. I sat in her chair at the kitchen table because I couldn't stand to look at it empty. I ate cereal for dinner for 11 straight nights before Rebecca showed up and cried at me until I let her cook. The first year was survival. I don't remember much of it, honestly. I remember Rebecca calling every Sunday. I remember the neighbor across the street, a guy named Dale, coming over on Saturdays to sit on the porch with me and not say anything, which was exactly right. I remember going through Margaret's closet 6 months in and finding a birthday card she'd already bought for me for the following March. I remember sitting on the bedroom floor holding that card for what must have been an hour. The second year is when the money problem showed up. I want to be plain about this because I know a lot of you are living inside it right now. Between Margaret's treatment and the funeral and the 2 years I didn't work overtime because I was taking care of her, I chewed through more of our savings than I realized. When I sat down with a calculator in January of 2022, here's what I had. Around $140,000 in what was left of the retirement account. The house paid off, worth maybe $210,000 on a good day in that market. My pension paying me about $1,600 a month. Social Security wasn't kicking in yet. Another year and change to wait. And that was it. That was my whole future in 3 numbers. The house alone cost me almost $14,000 a year to keep. Property taxes, insurance, gas, electric, water, the roof that needed replacing within 18 months, the driveway cracking every winter. I sat at that kitchen table with the calculator and I ran the math 4 different ways, and every version of it ended the same. If I stayed in Ohio, in that house, I'd be out of savings by the time I was 78. And after that, it was just Social Security and the pension. In Toledo, where a decent 1 bedroom apartment was already running $1,300 a month. I didn't tell Rebecca any of this. That was a mistake I made on purpose because I knew what would happen if I told her. Except she figured it out anyway, because that's what daughters do. She came over one Sunday in February, and she brought her husband Kyle, and she brought a folder. She sat down at the kitchen table across from me, and she opened that folder and she slid 3 pieces of paper toward me. The first one was a brochure for a place called Sunrise Meadows in Sylvania. Independent living, $6,200 a month, meals included. The second one was for a place in Perrysburg called Waterford Commons, $5,800 a month, but it had a memory care wing attached in case. And I want to quote her here, in case things change, Dad. The third one was for a smaller place in Bowling Green that was, quote, more affordable, at $4,900 a month. Kyle sat there and didn't say a word. Rebecca folded her hands and used her calm voice, the one she uses when she's already decided something and she's giving you a chance to agree with her before she pushes. She said, Dad, we just want you to be somewhere you're safe, somewhere there's people, somewhere we don't worry about you falling down the basement stairs when nobody's here. I looked at those 3 brochures. I looked at the smiling gray-haired people on the covers, playing bridge, doing watercolors, sitting in wing chairs by a fake fireplace. And I felt something I hadn't felt in the whole 2 years since Margaret died. I felt angry. Not at Rebecca. I need to say that. She meant well. She was scared. She'd already lost her mother and she was watching her father shrink inside a house that used to have laughter in it. And she wanted to solve the problem the only way she knew how. I understood every piece of it, but I sat there looking at $4,900 a month, which was 3 times what my pension paid. And I thought, what exactly do they think this is? What do they think I'm going to do? Eat the walls. And under that, quieter, I thought something worse. I thought, they think my life is done. They think the next thing is the last thing. They've already started grieving me while I'm sitting right here in front of them. I didn't say any of that. I said, let me think about it, Becca. And Kyle exhaled like he'd been holding his breath. And Rebecca hugged me. And they left. And I sat at that table until it got dark. Not moving, not eating, just staring at those 3 brochures spread out like a bad hand of cards. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in Margaret's chair at the kitchen table until the light started coming through the window over the sink. And I finally got up and made coffee. And I stood at that counter and drank it, and I said out loud to nobody, I'm not doing that. I am not doing that. Rebecca came back the following Saturday, just her this time. She sat down and she said, Dad, have you thought about it? And I said, yes. And she smiled, that hopeful smile. And I said, the answer is no. That smile went away. She got quiet the way she does when she's about to argue. And then she surprised me. She just nodded. She said, okay, Dad, then what's the plan? Because you can't stay in this house forever and you know it. She was right. That was the worst part. She was completely right. I told her I'd figure something out. I told her I needed a few months. She looked at me like she didn't believe me, but she let it go. And she got up and hugged me, and she left. And I sat back down at the table and I stared at the wall because I had no plan. I had nothing. I had a number that ran out at 78 and a house full of a woman who wasn't in it anymore. 2 weeks later, I was at the VA clinic in Toledo for a check on my blood pressure. I did 2 years in the Army in the late 70s. Never saw combat. I was stationed at Fort Riley, Kansas, filing paperwork and playing a lot of pinochle. But it earned me VA care, and I use it because it's free, and I don't say no to free. I was sitting in the waiting room reading a 2-year-old copy of Feel and Stream when a guy sat down next to me. Older than me by maybe 5 years, gray beard, ball cap that said Vietnam veteran on it. He nodded at me, I nodded at him, and we sat there in the quiet of a waiting room the way old men do. Then he said, "First time here?" I said, "No, I come every few months." He said, "I only come when I'm back in the country." I looked at him. I said, "Back from where?" He said, "Cebu, Philippines. I lived there." His name was Ron. He was 73. He'd been a diesel mechanic in Youngstown for most of his life. He'd lost his wife 6 years earlier to a stroke. He'd sold his house in 2018 and moved to a place called La Hague in Cebu City. And he'd been there ever since, coming back once a year to see his son and hit the VA for anything that needed a bigger workup. I asked him what it was like. He talked for 40 minutes. The nurse called him back twice and he waved her off. He told me his rent was 17,000 pesos a month, which he said was about $300. He told me a whole plate of lunch cost him $1 and change. He told me he had a doctor there, a young woman who trained in Manila, who charged him about $8 for an office visit and knew his whole history. He told me he had neighbors who brought him mangoes when the tree in their yard went crazy in April. He told me he'd been suicidal in 2017. That's the word he used, not depressed, suicidal. He said he'd sat in his living room in Youngstown with a bottle of wild turkey and a service pistol on the coffee table and made it through the night because his dog started whining at 3 in the morning. He said he sold everything within a year of that night, and he said moving to the Philippines saved his life. I sat there in that waiting room with my heart doing something strange in my chest. Not fast, just loud. And I said, "How did you know it would work?" He said, "I didn't. I just knew what was happening to me here wasn't working, and that was enough." The nurse called me back before I could ask him another thing. He wrote his email address on the corner of a magazine and tore it off and handed it to me. He said, "You email me if you're serious. I'll send you every group and every website and every mistake I made. Don't come here blind." I did, and it cost me. I put that scrap of paper in my wallet and I drove home in a snowstorm, one of those wet March storms Ohio does, where the road looks fine and then suddenly isn't. I got home and I hung up my coat and I sat at the computer for the first time in months, not to check my email or read the news, but to actually look something up. I typed in "retire in the Philippines, Cebu, cost of living." That was the first search. It was 10 at night. When I looked up next, it was almost 2 in the morning and I had 11 browser tabs open and I'd watched 4 YouTube videos about the SRRV, which is the Special Resident Retirees Visa. And I downloaded a document from a Facebook group called Retiring in Cebu that had a spreadsheet of monthly expenses from 12 different American expats. And I had, for the first time in 2.5 years, something that felt like the front edge of a plan. I want to be honest about something. I'm 68. I didn't grow up with computers. I still write checks sometimes because I like the ceremony of it. But when a thing gets a hold of you, you figure out the tool. Over the next 6 months, I turned into somebody I didn't recognize. I was in Facebook groups, I was on Reddit, I was watching a guy named Ricky on YouTube who'd been in the Philippines for over 10 years. I was watching a woman named Kyla who ran a channel out of Dumaguete. I was calculating peso to dollar conversions on my phone at the grocery store to see what the same cart of groceries would run me over there. I emailed Ron. He wrote back a message that was almost 3,000 words long. Every group, every visa consultant, every hospital in Cebu, every neighborhood he'd lived in and what was wrong with it, every mistake he'd made with rent contracts and cell phone plans. He'd typed it all out for a stranger he'd met once in a waiting room, and at the bottom he wrote, "Do not, and I mean do not, sign a lease longer than 3 months on your first place. I made that mistake. You will regret it if you do." I read that email 8 times. I told Rebecca in July. I picked a Sunday afternoon. Kyle wasn't there. My grandson was down for a nap. I sat her down on the porch and I told her I was going to take a scouting trip to the Philippines. 2 weeks. Cebu and Dumaguete. Just to look. Just to see it with my own eyes. She stared at me for a long time. Then she said, "You're serious?" I said, "I'm serious." She said, "Dad, do you have any idea how far the Philippines is?" I said, "About 17 hours of flying with a layover in either Tokyo or Seoul. And yes, I do." She started to cry a little and I hated it, but I didn't back down. I said, "Becca, I'm not saying I'm doing it. I'm saying I'm going to look. That's all. I'm not signing anything. I'm not selling the house. I just need to see it." She wiped her eyes and she said, "Dad, please just don't do anything crazy." I said, "Sweetheart, at my age, going to look at something is not crazy. Doing nothing is crazy. I've been doing nothing for 2 years and it's killing me." She left an hour later without saying much else. She hugged me tight before she got in the car. I booked the flight the next morning, September 14th. Out of Detroit, 17 hours through Tokyo Narita, landing in Manila on the 15th. Round trip, 2 weeks. Cost me $1,140 for the ticket, which felt like a lot, and also felt like the least crazy thing I'd spent money on in a decade. I landed in Manila on a Thursday afternoon in September, and I want to tell you the truth about the first hour, because it almost broke me. The airport was hot before I even got out of the jet bridge. That kind of hot that gets under your collar in 10 seconds. The immigration line was 90 minutes long. There was no air moving. The baby was crying somewhere behind me, and the mother looked as tired as I felt. When I finally got my stamp and got my suitcase and walked out of that arrivals hall, the wall of noise and heat and diesel and people hit me like a hand across the face, and I stood there for a full minute thinking, what have I done? I'd arranged a driver through the hotel, a young guy holding a sign with my name spelled Ratchard. He grinned when I laughed and said, "Close enough, sir." His name was Chun Chun. He grabbed my suitcase and led me out to a small van, and we sat in Manila traffic for 2 hours and 20 minutes to go what a map said was 11 miles. I stared out that window at things I'd never seen. Jeepneys packed with 15 people, kids hanging off the back, motorcycles with entire families on them, mom holding a baby, no helmets on anyone, vendors walking between cars in a dead stop on the highway selling water, cigarettes, phone chargers, boiled peanuts. A man on the side of the road grilling something on a stick over an actual open fire 6 feet from 4 lanes of traffic. It was overwhelming. It was too much. And underneath the overwhelm, I felt something else. I felt awake. For the first time in a long time, I was paying attention. I stayed 2 nights in Makati, the business district, at a decent hotel that cost me $64 a night. I walked around. I ate at a place called Mang Inasal, which is a Filipino chain that serves grilled chicken and unlimited rice for about $3. I sat in the food court at a mall called Greenbelt and watched families, and I drank a mango smoothie that was better than any dessert I'd had in 3 years. But Manila wasn't the plan. Cebu was. So on Saturday morning, I flew 45 minutes south to Mactan Cebu International Airport. And Junjun's cousin, a guy named Ray, picked me up on the other end and drove me to the Airbnb I'd booked in Lahag, the same neighborhood Ron had told me about. Lahag is up on the hill above Cebu City. My rental was a one-bedroom in a mid-rise building called the Persimmon, on the 8th floor, with a balcony that looked west toward the mountains. The rent for 2 weeks was 18,000 pesos, about $320. The owner, a woman named Marites, met me at the building with the keys, showed me around, pointed at the water shut-off, showed me how to work the aircon remote, and then before she left, she stopped and looked at me and said, "Sir Richard, first time in Cebu?" I said yes. She said, "You will love it here, but please, please be careful crossing the street. Our traffic is not like America." She smiled and patted my arm like I was her uncle. Then she was gone. I sat on that balcony my first night and drank a San Miguel Light that had cost me 38 pesos, less than 70 cents at the 7-Eleven downstairs. The sun went down behind the mountains and the city lit up below me. And I thought, okay, Ron was right. I can see this. I can see myself here. The next week was almost everything I'd hoped it would be. I ate at a Carinderia down the street, one of those little food stall places where you point at a warming tray and they load up a plate of rice and whatever meat you picked. 2 meals a day cost me under $6 total. I got a haircut at a small shop for 150 pesos, less than $3, from a barber named Boye who called me sir the entire time and asked me twice if the length was okay. I took a Grab car, which is their Uber, across the city for $2.40. I met an expat named Frank at a place called Sunnyside Cafe on my third morning. He was 71, from Portland, Oregon. He'd been in Cebu for 5 years. He sat down at my table uninvited after he heard me order in English, and he talked for 2 hours. He walked me through his monthly budget. He was living on $1,200 a month, including rent, food, aircon, health insurance, and a girlfriend, which he said with a wink I chose to ignore. He told me the best hospitals were Chonghua and Cebu doctors. He told me the SRRV would take about 4 months to process. He told me not to buy property ever, because as a foreigner you can't own the land under it and people get burned every year on that. I went to Changhua Hospital on a Tuesday, just walked in and asked to look around. The lobby was clean, air-conditioned, quiet. The staff was professional. I asked at the desk what a general checkup would cost as a walk-in, and the woman told me 1,200 pesos, about $22. I stood there in that lobby and I thought about the $8,000 bill I'd gotten in 2019 for a colonoscopy in Ohio. And I felt something shift in my chest that felt almost like laughter. But here's where I have to be honest, because if I make this all sound like a movie, I'm doing you a disservice. The doubts started small. On day 6, I was walking back to my building at 9:30 at night from a restaurant on Salinas Drive, and a man came out of an alley and started walking behind me. Not fast, not close, just there. I sped up, he sped up. I stopped in front of a lit convenience store and pretended to look at my phone. He walked past me and didn't even glance at me and turned the corner. Nothing happened. I want to be clear. Nothing happened. But my heart was hammering. And I stood in that 7-Eleven for 20 minutes buying nothing before I felt okay to walk the last 3 blocks home. On day 8, I got food poisoning. Something at a place I probably shouldn't have eaten. I was in the bathroom of that Airbnb for 11 hours and I couldn't stop shaking. And there was a moment at 4 in the morning when I was lying on the tile floor, sweating and shivering. And I realized I didn't know a single person in this country well enough to call. Ron was in the Philippines, but he was in a different city. Frank was an acquaintance. Marites was my landlord. I lay on that floor and I thought about what would happen if this were worse. If it were my heart. If I'd fallen. Nobody would find me for 2 weeks. On day 10, I went to an expat meetup at a bar in IT Park. It was supposed to be a friendly Tuesday night thing. There were 9 guys there. 6 of them spent the entire 2 hours complaining about Filipino drivers, about their girlfriends' families asking for money, about the internet, about how the government was corrupt, about how the food was too oily, about how the Philippines never worked right. One guy, a British man in his 60s, said, "Look, mate, you're going to hate half of it. You just accept that." I finished my beer and left early and walked back to my building and thought, if that's my community here, I'd rather be alone. I want to be careful. Cebu is a wonderful place. Ron loved it. Frank loved it. Millions of people love it. Those 3 bad days don't define it. But they were real. And by the end of that first week, I had a small, nagging voice in the back of my head that I hadn't expected to have. And it wouldn't shut up. 2 nights before I was supposed to fly home, I was eating lechon at a place called Subushon with a fellow American expat named George, another guy I'd met through the group. George was 74, had been in the Philippines 11 years, sharp guy, retired engineer. He asked me how the trip was going and I told him the truth. I told him about the man in the alley and the food poisoning and the meetup and the little nagging voice. He listened and he chewed his lechon and he didn't interrupt. When I was done, he wiped his mouth and he looked at me and he said, "Richard, can I ask you something? Before you fly home and sign anything or make any big move, have you been to Thailand?" I said no. He said, "Do yourself one favor. Before you decide anything, spend a week in Chiang Mai. That's it. 1 week. If you still want Cebu after that, come back. But you owe yourself the comparison. I lived in Chiang Mai for 3 years before I came here. I still don't know if I made the right call." I stared at him. I said, "George, my flight is in 36 hours. He said, "Then change it. You're already halfway around the world. Do you know how much a flight from Manila to Bangkok costs? Under $200. Do it. Regret is more expensive than a plane ticket." I went back to my Airbnb that night and sat on the balcony until almost 2 in the morning with my laptop open, staring at flights to Bangkok. And in the end, I did the least Ohio thing I have ever done in my life. I booked it. I called Rebecca before I did anything else. It was 10 in the morning her time. She picked up on the second ring, and I could hear my grandson in the background yelling about a cereal. I said, "Becca, I'm going to extend the trip a week." There was a long silence. Then she said, "Dad." I said, "1 more week. I'm going to Thailand. A guy I met here recommended it. I'm not making any decisions. I just want to compare." She said, Dad, you've been gone 12 days already. Kyle is worried. I'm worried. I said, I know, sweetheart. I know. I'm safe. I'm healthy. The trip has been good. I just need to be thorough about this, please. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, 1 week, and then you come home. Promise me. I said, I promise. I hung up and I sat on the edge of that bed in Cebu, and I felt like I was 17 years old and I just told my mother I was going to a party she hadn't approved. I flew out of Cebu the next afternoon, a short hop to Manila, a 4-hour layover, then a direct flight to Bangkok on Philippine Airlines. Landed at Suvarnabhumi Airport at 11 at night. Same wall of tropical air, but different. Cleaner somehow, I don't know how else to say it. The Manila air had smelled like diesel and street food and sweat. The Bangkok air smelled like jasmine and something sweet I couldn't place. I only had one night in Bangkok. I'd booked a hotel near the airport and a domestic flight to Chiang Mai the next morning. I got in a taxi at the airport that had a working meter, air conditioning that worked, and a driver who spoke almost no English, but who put on Google Translate and had a whole conversation with me about the Detroit Tigers because he'd seen my ball cap. That drive was 50 minutes and it cost me 380 baht, about $11. I want to pause here because this is one of those small things that piled up. In Manila, a taxi from the airport to Makati had cost me the equivalent of $42 and involved a driver who tried to negotiate the meter off and take me to a mall his cousin worked at. In Bangkok, my driver used the meter without me asking, drove me directly to my hotel, and helped me carry my suitcase to the door. I flew to Chiang Mai the next morning. 1 hour, 12 minutes in the air. It cost me 1,600 baht, about $46. Chiang Mai is in the north of Thailand, up in the mountains, and the air is cooler and drier than Bangkok. It's an old walled city, an actual square moat around the old part of town, with temples on every third block and mountains you can see from almost anywhere. The population is around 1.2 million, but it doesn't feel like it. It feels like a large town. The pace is slower. Nobody honks. I want you to hear that. In 3 days in Chiang Mai, I didn't hear a single horn. I'd booked a small hotel called the Riverside Guest House on the east bank of the Ping River for 4 nights. 240 baht cheaper than my Cebu Airbnb per night, and it came with breakfast. The owner was a woman in her 50s named Nok. She met me at the door with a Y, that little bow with the hands together, and she said, "Welcome, Kun Richard. Your room is ready. Would you like some tea?" I said yes. She brought me a small pot of jasmine tea and a plate of sliced mango. She sat me down in the lobby, which had ceiling fans and an open wall to the garden, and she asked me a few questions. Where was I from? How long was I staying? Was this my first time? When I told her I was coming from the Philippines and I was comparing, she smiled. And she said, then I will not sell Thailand to you. You will decide for yourself. But I will tell you where to eat. She wrote out a list on a piece of hotel stationery. 9 places. She numbered them. She marked which one was for breakfast and which one was for late night noodles. When she handed it to me, she said, "Please do not tip too much. The prices are already fair. Big tips make trouble." I sat in my room that night with the balcony door open, listening to nothing, not silence. The sound of the river and some crickets, and once, very far away, a temple bell. And I thought, I've been in this country for 6 hours, and I have already been treated better than I was in most of Cebu. And immediately after I thought that, I felt guilty because Cebu had been good to me. It had. But something was different here. I couldn't name it yet. The first full day I walked. I walked the Moat Road, the whole square, which is about 4 miles around. I stopped at 3 temples. At Wat Phra Singh, an old monk in orange robes stopped me at the entrance and asked in careful English if I would like a blessing. I said yes. He tied a small white string around my wrist and said a few words I didn't understand and touched my forehead with his fingertips. And he smiled at me and said, "For good health, long life." I gave a small donation to the temple box and I walked back out into the sunlight with that white string on my wrist, and I felt something I hadn't felt since Margaret died. I felt like somebody had wished good on me and meant it. I ate lunch at a place called Khao Soi Kun Yai, a tiny shop that Nock had put on the list. Khao Soi is a northern Thai curry noodle soup with crispy noodles on top. The bowl cost me 55 baht, $1.60. It was one of the best things I have ever put in my mouth. There was a Thai family at the next table with 3 kids, and the youngest, a girl of maybe 4, kept peeking at me over the back of her chair. And every time I made a face at her, she'd giggle and duck. Her mother saw and laughed and said something to the girl. And then to me she said, "She's very shy." Sorry. I said, "She's very brave. She's just checking me out." The mother laughed and translated, and the girl covered her face with both hands. That evening, I met a fellow expat by accident. I was walking through the Sunday night market, which sprawls through the old city every week, and a tall man with a gray ponytail bumped into me and apologized, and then heard my accent and said, "American?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Me too. Where are you from?" I said, "Ohio." He said, "Michigan. Come get a beer if you have time." His name was Wayne. He was 72, from Grand Rapids. He'd been in Chiang Mai 8 years. He'd been a dentist, widower, one son back in Michigan. He walked me over to a small bar on a side street where the beer was 90 baht, about $2.60. And he sat down and asked me the same question George had asked me in Cebu. What was I doing here? I told him the whole thing. Margaret, the house, the brochures, running the VA, Cebu, the 3 bad days, George, the plane ticket. Wayne listened without interrupting. When I was done, he said, "Richard, I moved here after Chiang Mai for the same reason you're sitting here. I'd been in Cebu for 2 years. Loved a lot of it. Didn't love the noise. Didn't love the safety issues. Didn't love the way the expat community talked. Came here for 1 week to compare. Never left." I said, "Never?" He said, "Never. And I'm not telling you that to sell you on it. I'm telling you because you're going to notice a lot of things this week. Notice them. Don't ignore them. Don't be polite to yourself. Compare honestly." I asked him about healthcare. He told me about Bangkok Hospital, Chiang Mai. Told me his last full checkup, blood work included, cost him 3,200 baht, about $92, and took 90 minutes total. I asked him about the visa. He told me about the non-immigrant OA retirement visa. Age 50 and over. You need 800,000 baht in a Thai bank, about $23,000, or a monthly income equivalent, or a combination. Renewable every year. Easier than the SRRV in some ways, harder in others. He said, "Do the reading. Don't take my word." I asked him about the community. He said, "It's what you make of it. The complainers exist here too. Don't sit with them. There are book clubs, hiking groups, volunteer programs, Language classes. If you want a life, you can build one. If you want to sit at a bar and be angry, you can do that too. He walked me back toward my guest house at 10:30 at night, through streets that were full of tourists and locals and monks and food carts, and I felt safe in a way I had not felt walking home in Lahuk. It's not that Cebu was unsafe, it's that Chiang Mai felt different in my body. My shoulders were down. I wasn't checking behind me. At the corner where we split, Wayne turned to me and he said, "Give it the whole week. Don't decide anything until day 6. I said I would. I walked the rest of the way to the guest house under the string lights of the old city, past a monk sweeping the steps of a small wat, and I thought, oh, I thought, I might be in trouble here. I gave it the whole week the way Wayne told me to, and by day 5 I was in trouble. Day 3 was the hospital visit, not because anything was wrong. I just wanted to see. Wayne had told me to walk in as a walk-in, ask for a general checkup, and see for myself. I took a red Song Thao, which is a covered pickup truck that runs like a shared taxi from the old city to Bangkok Hospital, Chiang Mai. It cost me 40 baht, about $1.15. The driver dropped me at the main entrance and pointed at the sliding glass doors and gave me a thumbs up. I walked in and I stopped. The lobby looked like a nice hotel. Marble floors, potted plants, a receptionist in a greased blue uniform who looked up and smiled and said in perfect English, "Good morning, sir. How can I help you?" I told her I was a walk-in, no appointment, and I wanted a general checkup. She handed me a form on a clipboard, showed me to a seat, and told me it would be about 15 minutes. It was 11 minutes. A nurse called my name. She spoke English better than half the nurses I'd dealt with in Toledo. She took my blood pressure, my temperature, my weight. She asked me the standard questions. Then she walked me to a small office where a doctor in her 40s was waiting. Her name was Dr. Sapon. She'd trained in Bangkok and done a fellowship in Melbourne. She sat with me for 25 minutes. She looked at my blood pressure numbers, asked about my history, asked about Margaret and how I was sleeping, asked about my father's heart, my mother's diabetes. She wrote out a small note about cutting back on salt and gave me a card in case I ever wanted to come back for a full workup. The bill for that visit, including the consultation and the vitals, was 1,400 baht, about $40. I stood at the payment window holding that receipt, and I thought about the $11,000 I still owed the Cleveland Clinic from Margaret's last 3 weeks. I thought about the $1,700 bill I'd gotten in 2021 for a single MRI. I thought about my neighbor Dale, who'd been rationing his insulin for 6 months because his supplemental had changed. I stood there for so long, the woman at the window said, "Sir, are you okay?" And I said, Yes, I'm okay, sorry." I walked out of that hospital, and I stood in the parking lot in the sunlight, and I felt something in me start to give up on the Philippines. Not because Cebu had been bad, because this had been so easy. Day 4 was the food and the pace. I ate breakfast at a little place called Rustic and Blue, sitting at an outdoor table. A plate of eggs and toast and fresh fruit and a proper coffee cost me 180 baht, about $5.20. I read a book for an hour. Nobody rushed me. The waitress refilled my water twice without asking. A cat wandered under the table and sat on my foot. I walked from there through the old city to a temple called Wat Chedi Luang, which is a ruined 13th century pagoda in the middle of the city. And I sat on a stone bench in the shade for 45 minutes and watched monks and tourists and pigeons, and I didn't think about anything. I want to name that specifically because I hadn't done it in 3 years. I sat somewhere and I didn't think about Margaret or money or Rebecca's face at that kitchen table or the brochure for Sunrise Meadows. I just sat. My shoulders were down, my jaw was unclenched. And when I got up, I noticed I felt different. And I noticed I hadn't been feeling different in a very long time. Day 5 was the food poisoning ghost. I ate lunch at a street stall Nog had circled twice on her list. Pad Kra Pao, that basil chicken over rice with a fried egg on top. It cost me 60 baht, less than $2. My stomach was fine. It had been fine the whole week. I remember eating that plate and thinking, I had 2 bouts of stomach trouble in Cebu in 12 days. I've had none here. I know 1 week is not a fair test. I know that. But I'm keeping track. Day 5 was also the retirement vasa. I took a grab car to an office called Chiang Mai Immigration Consultants, and I sat down with a woman employee who walked me through the non-immigrant OA. She told me about the 800,000 baht in a Thai bank. She told me about the health insurance requirement. She told me the process took about 4 to 6 weeks with a good agent. Cost around 35,000 baht in fees, about $1,000, and had to be renewed annually. She didn't try to sell me. She handed me a folder with printed pages and said, "Read this. Come back with questions. Do not decide today." I walked out of that office and I sat down on a bench outside and I opened that folder and I read every page. And when I was done, I sat there for another 20 minutes and I did the math I'd been avoiding. If I sold the house for 210,000 and paid off nothing because it was already paid off, and I put 800,000 baht in a Thai bank as the visa deposit, I still had almost $180,000 left in liquid savings, plus the pension, plus Social Security kicking in about 14 months. My monthly cost in Chiang Mai, based on Wayne's actual budget and Frank's actual budget in Cebu, adjusted for what I'd seen this week, would run me somewhere between $1,300 and $1,500 a month, everything included. My pension alone covered it. I would never run out of money. Not at 78, not at 88, not at 98. My savings would grow, not shrink. Grow. I sat on that bench and I put my hands over my face and I cried a little. Not sad crying. Something else. The kind of crying that happens when a weight you've been carrying so long you forgot it was there finally comes off. Day 6 was the sunset at Doi Suthep. Wayne took me up. It's a temple on a mountain overlooking the city, and you climb 306 steps to get to it. And I took my time, and I stopped twice, and Wayne didn't make a joke about it. And at the top, I stood on the terrace, and I looked out over Chiang Mai as the sun dropped behind the mountains, and the whole city turned gold, and then rose, and then purple. And Wayne stood next to me, and he said, "You know, don't you?" I said, "Yeah, I know." He said, "You want to tell me?" I said, "I want to move here. Not there, here." He nodded and he looked out at the city and he said, "Then that's what you're going to do. Take your time, do it right, but you know now." I flew back to Cebu the next morning. I had 2 more days on my original ticket and I used them to walk through Lahug one more time and be sure. I ate at the Carinderia. I sat on the balcony. I said goodbye to Marites and thanked her for everything. I met Frank one more time for coffee and I told him the truth. He wasn't hurt. He shook my hand and he said, "Chiang Mai is a good city. If it fits you, It fits you. Don't apologize. The hard call was Rebecca. I called her from the Manila airport the night before my flight home, 2 in the morning her time. I woke her up. I said, Becca, I need to tell you something and I need you to hear me out. She said, Dad, what? I said, I'm not moving to the Philippines. She said, oh, thank God. And then, before she could get too happy, I said, I'm moving to Thailand instead. Silence on the line. Long silence. Then quietly, Dad, another country. I said, Chiang Mai, northern Thailand. Becca, the health care, the cost, the pace, the community, all of it. It's better for me. I know this is hard to hear at 2 in the morning, but I've done the work. I've done the reading. I've been to a hospital there. I've talked to a visa lawyer. I have numbers, real numbers. She was crying a little, not big crying, the tired kind. She said, Dad, why can't you just come home? I said, because home isn't home anymore, sweetheart. It hasn't been for 3 years. And I can't sit in Ohio and wait to run out of money and end up in a place that costs $5,000 a month to keep me alive. I can't do that. And I'm not going to. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, are you going to be safe? I said, yes. She said, are you going to come back and see us? I said, every year. Twice a year if I can afford it. And you and Kyle and Ethan are going to come see me. I'll pay for the flights. She said, Dad. I said, Becca, please, trust me. She said, okay, Dad, okay, I don't understand, but okay. I flew home 2 days later. I walked into that empty house on a cold Ohio morning in October, and I did not sit down. I did not take my coat off. I stood in the kitchen and I looked at the calendar and I picked a date, 6 weeks out. And I called a realtor before I unpacked my suitcase. She came the next day. She priced the house at $219,000. It sold in 11 days for $207,000. I gave away most of the furniture. I kept photos, some of Margaret's clothes I couldn't part with, my dad's watch, the birthday card she'd bought me. Everything else went. Rebecca and Kyle helped me pack the last weekend. Rebecca cried twice and pretended she wasn't. Ethan, my grandson, gave me a drawing he'd made of an airplane with a stick figure inside labeled Grandpa that I still have taped to my refrigerator in Chiang Mai. I flew out of Detroit on a snowy Tuesday in December. I landed in Chiang Mai 29 hours later. Nak picked me up from the airport in her small white sedan. She'd offered when I emailed her 3 weeks before. She drove me to a small apartment I'd rented sight unseen through a friend of Wayne's, a 1-bedroom on the top floor of a building in the Niman neighborhood, 12,000 baht a month, about $340. She helped me carry my 2 suitcases up. She showed me the aircon remote. She smiled at me and said, welcome home, Kun Richard. I stood in the middle of that empty apartment and I set my suitcase down and I did not cry this time. I just stood there. And I thought, okay, here we go. The first month in Chiang Mai was learning the shape of a new life, where the grocery store was, which Songtheo went, which direction, which side of the road the traffic came from when I crossed, how to say hello, which is Sawadee krap for a man, and thank you, which is Kop Kun krap. I got the tones wrong for the first 6 weeks, and Nok laughed at me every time and corrected me the same patient way Boy at the barber had. And slowly I got it right. I found my coffee shop on day 9, a small place 2 blocks from my apartment called Rister Eito. The owner was a Thai man in his 40s named Arm, who'd won a world barista competition, which I didn't know when I walked in the first time. I ordered a black coffee. He raised an eyebrow and said, You want the flat white. Trust me. I said, okay. It was the best coffee I have ever had in my life. I went back the next morning. He nodded at me. On day 4, he said, flat white, Kun Richard. I said, flat white, Kun Arm. He grinned. By week 3, he had it on the counter before I sat down. I met my neighbors within the first 2 weeks. The couple across the hall was a Thai woman named Ploy, no relation to the visa lady, and her Australian husband named Michael, both in their 60s, retired teachers. She knocked on my door on day 5 with a small container of green curry and rice and said, for welcome, not too spicy. Michael introduced himself the next morning in the elevator. Within a month, I was going over to their place for dinner every other Wednesday. The woman who ran the laundry 3 doors down was named Kun Mali. She was maybe 55, always smiling, ran the place with her daughter. She washed and folded a full week of my clothes for 140 baht, about $4. She started calling me Papa Richard by month 2, and I didn't correct her because I didn't want her to stop. I started walking every morning at 6:30. Along the Pink River, past the fruit vendors setting up, past a small wat where 3 monks would be doing their alms round, past a coffee cart run by a young woman named Fa, who sold me an iced Americano for 50 baht every day, whether I looked like I needed it or not. 3 miles most mornings. My blood pressure came down 13 points in the first 3 months. Dr. Supporn checked it herself and told me to keep doing whatever I was doing. I want to tell you about the medical scare because it happened and it matters. It was April, about 4 months in. I was walking back from the market with a bag of mangoes and I felt something wrong in my chest. Not sharp, heavy, like somebody was pressing down. My left arm didn't feel great either. I sat down on a low wall outside a temple and I tried to breathe slowly. A monk sweeping the courtyard saw me, and I don't know what showed on my face, but he came right over. He didn't speak English. He held up one finger, meaning wait, and he ran. Actually ran, in his orange robes. He came back 3 minutes later with another monk and a young man with a phone who spoke English. That young man called for a grab and stayed with me until it arrived and rode with me to Bangkok hospital and would not accept money when I tried to give him some. He shook his head. He put his hand over his heart. He said, "You're okay. Please take care." Then he left. They took me in immediately. EKG in under 10 minutes. Blood work. Dr. Supporn was not on duty, but a cardiologist named Dr. Kittipong saw me within 20 minutes. He was gentle and thorough. He explained everything as he did it. It was not a heart attack. It was a stress episode combined with mild dehydration. And he wanted me to stay 4 hours for observation and a stress test. I stayed 6 hours. They ran everything. When I left, the bill for the emergency visit, the EKG, the blood panel, the stress test, and the observation was 14,200 baht. About $410. I sat in the taxi on the way home and I thought about the same visit in Toledo. $12,000. Easy. Maybe more. I thought about that monk running in his robes. I thought about the young man who wouldn't take money. I thought about Dr. Kittipong sitting on the edge of the bed to explain the results to me instead of standing in the doorway looking at a chart. I called Rebecca that night. I told her what happened. I told her I was fine. I told her the bill. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Dad, in Ohio that would have wiped you out." I said, "I know." She said, "Send me a picture of the hospital." I sent her 3. The lobby, my room, the receipt. She called back an hour later. She said, Dad, is this really what it's like? I said, this is really what it's like. She said, I'm coming to see you. She and Kyle and Ethan came in June. 6 months after I moved, I picked them up at the airport at midnight. Ethan was asleep on Kyle's shoulder. Rebecca hugged me for a long time in the arrivals hall and then pulled back and looked at me and said, Dad, you look different. I said, different how? She said, younger, I don't know, rested. They stayed 12 days. I did not try to sell them on anything. I let them see it. I took them to Rister Aid too. Arm shook Carl's hand and said, your father drinks the flat white. Excellent taste. Rebecca laughed. I took them to Kunmali's laundry and Ethan, who was 6, immediately started petting a stray cat that hung around there. And Mally told him in careful English that the cat's name was Somtam. And Ethan spent 45 minutes in her shop while Rebecca and I sat on plastic stools drinking Thai iced tea, and Molly showed her pictures of her grandchildren on her phone. I took them to Doi Southep at sunset. I took them to the Sunday night market, and Ethan got a wooden elephant carved for him for 120 baht by an old man who let him watch every knife stroke. I took them to Ploy and Michael's for dinner, and Ploy made 3 different curries, and Michael and Kyle talked about Australian rules football for 2 hours. On night 10, Rebecca and I were sitting on my balcony after Ethan had gone to sleep. Kyle was reading inside. It was quiet the way it gets in Chiang Mai after 9 at night. She had a cup of tea. I had one too. She said, Dad. I said, yeah, Becca. She said, I was wrong. I said, about what? She said, about all of it. The brochures, assisted living, trying to keep you close. I thought I was helping. I was scared. And I thought putting you somewhere safe was the same as loving you. And it wasn't. This is loving you. Letting you be here. Where you're happy. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. She said, Mom would have hated Sunrise Meadows, Dad. She'd have hated it. She'd have loved this. I said, yeah, she would have loved this. We sat there for a while and didn't say anything else. Down below, somebody was closing up a food car. A dog barked once and then was quiet. They flew home 2 days later. At the airport, Ethan hugged me and said, Grandpa, when we come back, can we go to the elephant place? I told him yes. Rebecca hugged me and said, twice a year. Us here or you there. Deal? I said, deal. That was over a year and a half ago now. I'm 68 years old. I've been in Chiang Mai for a little over 2 years. I have a small apartment with a balcony and a plant Ploy gave me that I have somehow not killed. I have a coffee shop where they know my order. I have a doctor I trust. I have friends whose faces I recognize on the street. I have a laundry lady who calls me Papa Richard. I have monks who nod at me on my morning walk. I have a grandson who has been here twice and who calls the country his father's daughter's country, which makes no sense, and it's the most wonderful sentence in the world. I have my pension. I have Social Security now. I have savings that are bigger than they were when I sold the house. I have not run out of money and I am not going to. I miss Margaret every single day. That does not go away and I would not want it to. But I do not carry her ghost around this apartment the way I carried her ghost around that house in Ohio. And I think she'd be glad about that. I want to tell you something before we finish. If you're sitting there where I was sitting 2.5 years ago at a kitchen table with a calculator and a folder full of brochures and a daughter who loves you and is scared for you, please hear this. Do the research. Go and look. Do not sign the first thing anybody puts in front of you. Go and see with your own eyes what your options actually are, because you have more of them than you think. And the picture in your head of what old age has to look like is not the only picture. I want to mention one thing that would have saved me a lot of stumbling. There's a book called The Honest Move that walks through the real numbers, the cities compared, the visa systems, how healthcare actually works, and the traps that catch people in their first year overseas. I didn't have it when I went. I put a lot of it together the hard way from strangers in waiting rooms and expat boss tools. If you're seriously thinking about a move like this, whether it's Thailand or the Philippines or Portugal or Mexico or anywhere else, that book covers the stuff nobody tells you. There's a link in the description if you want to check it out. No pressure. Just wanted to mention it because it would have saved me weeks. If this story meant something to you, or if you know somebody sitting at a kitchen table right now with a calculator and no plan, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit the like button and subscribe. I've got more stories like this one coming. Real stories, not fairy tales. Thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next one.